Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be diving in.
Today we're getting into something pretty fundamental, I think. How does music actually make us feel things?
Right, that emotional punch. We've got some fascinating philosophical takes on this, based on the sources you shared with us.
Yeah, we're asking how music moves us. Is it the tune itself, our memories, something else entirely?
Exactly. We'll look at personal connections, whether music has emotions built in, and even these ideas about music telling stories or, exploring philosophical concepts. Should be thought-provoking.
Okay, let's start with that our song feeling. Everyone knows that, right?
Definitely.
One source brings up Edward Hanslick's idea of music having a pathological effect.
Yeah, and pathological sounds bad, but he didn't mean like diseased.
No, not sick. More like how our own stuff, our circumstances and feelings affect how we hear the music.
Precisely. It's about the listener's state. Hanslick's examples were things like the homesick soldier hearing an anthem, or Rick in Casablanca with As Time Goes By.
Ah, yes, classic.
The music gets tangled up with their personal history, their specific emotions in that moment. That's the pathological link he meant.
So the song becomes powerful because of that personal connection, that specific memory.
Exactly. But here's Hanslick's kicker.
Go on.
He argued these connections, while totally real and powerful for the individual, have basically zero aesthetic relevance. They don't tell us if the music itself is any good, artistically speaking.
Right, so your personal tearjerker moment doesn't mean the song is a masterpiece. It's about your history, not the music's subjective quality.
That's the idea. Key takeaway there. Personal ties are strong, but separate from artistic value.
Okay, so if it's not just personal baggage, what else could it be? Maybe music itself contains emotions, like inherent properties.
That's the next idea. Maybe we hear melancholy or cheerfulness in the music, like it's a quality of the sound.
So the music is sad or is cheerful.
Yeah, and because we recognize that, it supposedly makes us feel that way too.
Wait, how does just recognizing sadness in something make us feel sad? That seems like a jump.
It is a jump. That's the central puzzle. Like you said, seeing an actor pretend to be sad doesn't usually make us genuinely sad. So how does music do it?
So theories try to bridge that gap. What's first? The persona theory.
Right, the persona theory. This suggests that, especially with instrumental music that sounds expressive, we kind of imagine a character, a musical persona.
Like someone inside the music expressing feelings.
Sort of. Edward Cohn initially called it the composer's voice, but others, like Gerald Levinson, refined it. Levinson said it's not necessarily the composer's actual feelings,
Okay.
but more like a fictional character. Think Mozart's G minor symphony.
Yeah.
Maybe it sounds grieving, but it's like a character grieving, not necessarily Mozart himself in that moment.
Like Hamlet expressing angst in a soliloquy.
Exactly like that. The idea is we empathize with this imagined musical persona. We feel sad with the sad-sounding persona, like we feel for characters in books or films.
Okay, that connects to how we react to fiction. We do feel for characters.
We do. But the objection comes quickly. This musical persona, it's imaginary. It's not real. Why feel real emotions for something completely made up, even more abstract than a character in a novel?
Good point.
The counter-argument, though, is simply that we do feel for fictional characters all the time, even knowing they're not real. So maybe the imaginary nature isn't a killer blow to the theory.
Fair enough. But the source lists other problems, right?
Yeah.
3 main ones.
Yeah. First, just personal experience. The author mentions they're often moved by music, but don't find themselves actually imagining these persona.
So the theory doesn't match everyone's listening experience.
It might not. Second, and this seems weightier, the analogy to literary characters is weak. Musical personae are often incredibly vague.
How so?
Well, you often can't even tell basic things about them. Gender, age, specific situation. It's usually just an emotion. Melancholy, joy, whatever. Compare that to Anna Karenina. We know her history, her thoughts, her relationships.
Right. It's hard to empathize deeply with just sadness floating in the air. The source jokes, even Peter Rabbit has more personality.
Huh. Yeah, that lack of detail makes the connection much weaker than with a well-drawn fictional character. Key point. The persona is just too abstract.
Okay, what's the third problem?
It's about how emotions actually work between people. We don't always just mirror the emotions we see.
True. Someone's anger might make me feel fear, not anger.
Exactly. Or someone's grief might evoke sympathy, pity, maybe even relief, depending on the context. Our responses are complex. The persona theory assumes a simple mirroring sad music persona makes us sad. Why should it always work that way?
It doesn't seem like it would. Which leads to weird conclusions, like happy music making us sad sometimes.
Potentially, yeah, if we react against the persona's emotion. So the persona theory, while interesting, has these pretty significant hurdles.
Okay, so if the persona idea is shaky, what's next? The tendency theory.
Yeah, a leaner approach. This one ditches the persona. It just focuses on the music's expressive qualities themselves.
Like colors. Yellow feels cheerful, black feels somber.
That's the analogy. The theory, put forward by people like Colin Radford and Stephen Davies, suggests that music expressing cheerfulness has a tendency to make us cheerful. Somber music tends to make us somber.
Just a tendency, though.
Just a tendency. Davies uses this example. Imagine working in a factory that only makes tragic masks. Day in, day out, surrounded by sad faces.
Okay. I'm feeling depressed already.
Right. His point is that constant exposure to that expression would likely affect your mood eventually. The tendency of the masks would start to have a real effect.
Makes sense in that extreme scenario. But how does that apply to music?
Well, the source jumps on that right away. A tendency isn't the same as an actual effect.
Like, my car can go 100 miles per hour, but it rarely does. The tendency exists, but the effect doesn't happen often.
Exactly. And we don't usually listen to music like working in that mask factory nonstop, overwhelming exposure. We listen for maybe an hour or two.
A sad painting on the wall doesn't usually plunge me into depression.
Precisely. So the argument is, under normal listening conditions, this supposed tendency is too weak to actually do much.
Plus, people often go to concerts featuring sad or tragic music and come out feeling exhilarated, right?
Especially if it was a great performance. Not depressed.
That's a key observation. So the tendency theory might be technically true. Maybe there's a slight pull, but it fails to explain how music actually moves us most of the time. Key idea. The tendency is likely too weak to matter in normal listening.
Okay, both persona and tendency theories seem flawed. And this leads to a really big question.
The problem of unpleasant emotions.
Yeah. If sad music just makes us feel sad, or angry music makes us angry, why on earth would we seek it out? We generally avoid feeling bad.
Absolutely. The source notes that when music does make us feel genuinely bad, because of a personal link like Rick avoiding it as time goes by, we do avoid it.
So why listen to depressing symphonies? The source compares it to tragic literature like King Lear. Right. With tragedy in literature or drama, we often talk about artistic transformation or maybe learning something, some kind of catharsis like Aristotle suggested.
Language helps there. Stories can explore why things are tragic, give context, maybe offer moral lessons.
But can instrumental music do that? Can it create a pleasing melancholy just through sound? Or teach us deep life lessons without words? The source seems skeptical.
It sounds a bit forced, like we're trying too hard to justify enjoying sad sounds. Do we really need Beethoven to tell us struggle exists?
It can feel trivial when put that way, and honestly, philosophers are still debating why we engage with tragedy, even in literature. So a theory of musical emotion would be stronger if it didn't have to solve the puzzle of why we enjoy negative feelings.
Okay, so where does that leave us? The source hints at a different direction.
Yes, moving towards what it calls enhanced formalism. It starts by looking again at how everyday emotions actually work.
The object belief feeling structure.
Exactly. You feel an emotion about something, the object, based on a belief about that object, which leads to the feeling. Anger at Dave, object, because I believe he cheated, belief, leading to the feeling of anger.
Anza kind of touched on this too, right? The need for definite thoughts.
He did. And this framework highlights the issue with fiction. Again, the lack of genuine belief. We don't truly believe Anna Karenina is real, which makes our emotional response a bit paradoxical.
Okay, so object, belief, feeling. How does this apply to music?
Well, hold that thought. First, let's revisit the persona and tendency theories with this framework. A big criticism arises. They disconnect the music's quality from the emotion.
Meaning?
According to those theories, any music recognized as sad should tend to make you sad, whether it's beautifully composed or just bad.
It doesn't seem right. I'm usually moved by music, I find.
Well, good. Beautiful, powerful, skillful. My point exactly. We're moved by aesthetic significance. And another consequence. According to those arousal theories, music that isn't clearly expressing garden variety emotions like sadness or joy shouldn't be deeply moving.
But that's not true either. What about really serene, beautiful music, like some Renaissance choral music.
Perfect example. Think Josquin des Prés or Orlandus Lassus, often sung a cappella by male choirs. It might not sound overtly sad or happy in the way a romantic symphony does.
But it can be incredibly beautiful, awe-inspiring even, deeply moving in its own way.
Exactly. So this leads to the alternative proposal. What moves us emotionally in music is its beauty, its magnificence, its grace, its power, its positive aesthetic qualities.
So the emotion isn't sadness or joy, but something like wonder, excitement, awe.
Precisely. In this view, the object of the emotion is the beautiful music itself. The belief is that the music is beautiful, powerful, sublime, whatever, and the feeling is that resulting excitement, awe, wonder, enthusiasm.
And this solves the problem of unpleasant emotion.
So.
Because we're not feeling sad from the sad music. We're feeling moved by the beauty of the sad music. The emotion is appreciation, not melancholy itself.
You've got it. The sadness is part of the object we appreciate, but the feeling aroused is positive aesthetic appreciation. Key takeaway. We're often moved by music's beauty, not necessarily made to feel the specific emotion it expresses.
That feels much closer to my experience.
And interestingly, even proponents of the other theories admit the emotions music arises are often quasi-emotions. They feel like the real thing, but lack the usual behavioral punch.
Like sad music doesn't make you actually want to withdraw or cry necessarily.
Right. And this new musical emotion, the awe or excitement at the beautiful music, could also be seen as quasi. It has an emotion, say, melancholy, as part of its object without being melancholy itself.
And maybe this explains the confusion. Why people think sad music makes them sad.
Possibly. The source suggests they might be feeling excitement with melancholy as its object and just mislabeling that complex feeling as simple melancholy.
Interesting. Okay, so that's a strong case for it's kind of enhanced formalism. But now we have to confront the foes of formalism.
Indeed. People who insist music is about more than just form and beauty. Narrative and philosophical interpretations.
The fact that people do interpret music this way seems like a challenge to formalism.
It could be seen that way. We need to look critically at these non-formalist ways of listening.
So interpreting absolute music, music without words or a set program, as telling stories or expressing philosophical ideas.
Right. And narrative seems a more common route than, say, trying to interpret music like a painting, because both music and stories unfold over time.
Why do people feel formalism is wanting? What's missing for them?
One big charge is that formalism makes music seem like, well, just meaningless noise. Beautiful noise, maybe, but ultimately empty.
Like fancy sounds without substance.
Kind of. Music is human-made, structured, almost like language in some ways. Language exists to convey meaning. So if formalism says music doesn't convey that kind of meaning, it can feel like it's reducing music to sophisticated babble.
And that might make it seem less important, less connected to human life and culture.
That's the worry for some. It can seem remote from the rest of the humanities, despite its huge cultural role.
So people look for content, and narrative is a common place to find it. But why is storytelling itself seen as so important?
Well, there's the idea that stories, especially great ones, can express deep truths, philosophical, moral, social truths. They can impart knowledge about the human condition.
Although, not everyone agrees that fiction actually does that. True, that's a whole other debate. But even if stories can convey knowledge, just saying music is a story doesn't automatically mean it conveys profound knowledge. The musical story would have to be, a meaningful one.
And we already talked about how hard it seems to find really substantial philosophical or moral weight in purely musical narratives.
Exactly. So let's look at how people try to do this narrative interpretation. There are sort of weak and strong versions.
Trying to find that balance between too vague and too specific. That's the tightrope. Weak narrative interpretation often talks about plot archetypes.
General patterns, like the hero's journey or rags to riches.
Yeah, things like The Long Voyage Home, Odyssey, Wizard of Oz, or maybe struggle through adversity to ultimate triumph.
And the claim is that symphonies embody these archetypes, like Beethoven's Fifth being the struggle to triumph story.
That's a classic example. Brahms' First, Mendelssohn's Scotch Symphony, sometimes interpreted through these archetypal lenses. The supposed benefit is you don't need specific characters or events.
Hang on. The source points out a logical flaw here, right?
A big one. How can something have a plot archetype if it doesn't have an actual plot?
You can't get divorced if you were never married.
Exactly. An archetype is an abstraction from multiple specific plots. If there's no specific plot in the music, claiming it has an archetype doesn't make sense.
So Music can express emotions, maybe actions, but that's not the same as having even an archetypal plot.
Right. Weak narrative interpretation seems logically shaky. Key point. No plot, no plot archetype.
Okay, so what about strong narrative interpretation, making up specific stories?
This is where interpreters propose quite detailed plots. Susan McClary is mentioned as a prominent figure doing this.
And she sometimes brings in gender and sexuality themes.
She does, though we're focusing on the narrative aspect itself. The source uses her interpretation of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony as an example.
What's the story she suggests?
It's roughly about a man feeling trapped by society's expectations of masculinity and heterosexuality, hindering his true, perhaps homosexual self, with musical themes representing feminine entrapment and patriarchal pressure.
Wow, that's very specific for instrumental music.
It is, and it immediately raises huge questions. Can music alone really tell that story? What's the evidence? Could Tchaikovsky have intended it? Does intention even matter? How does this affect how we hear the symphony?
Yeah, deep waters there, touching on general theories of art interpretation.
And it's not just narratives. Philosophical interpretations pop up too. David Schroeder reading Haydn's Symphony No. 83 as expressing Enlightenment tolerance.
Same kinds of questions apply, I assume. How can sounds convey abstract concepts like tolerance?
Exactly. Which brings us back to intention.
Does the composer's intention fix the meaning?
That's the debate. Intentionalism versus anti-intentionalism. The source leans towards intentionalism. A work means what its creator intended it to mean, roughly speaking.
And apparently, many non-formalist interpreters, like McClary and Schroeder, try to argue the composer could have intended their reading.
Yes, they often try to build a case based on the composer's life or cultural context, Tchaikovsky's sexuality, Haydn's links to Enlightenment circles.
Does the source buy these arguments?
It expresses skepticism about proving intent, but focuses more on the next step. Even if they intended it, could the music actually convey that meaning?
The limits of music itself as a communication medium.
Precisely. The argument is that even McClary's strong narrative for Tchaikovsky is still pretty vague, probably to maintain some credibility, but her plot needs concepts, patriarchal expectations, feminine entrapment, homosexual identity.
Things that seem to require words.
Exactly. Can textless music really express those abstract ideas? Calling one theme feminine and another masculine is pretty limited and culturally loaded anyway.
You need nouns, verbs, concepts, language to tell a proper story or make a philosophical argument.
Right. Even visual storytelling, like comics or silent films, often relies heavily on text captions or dialogue cards. And visual representation is usually much more universally understood than musical representation.
Good point. A picture of a tree is recognizable almost anywhere. A musical phrase meaning tree would be highly specific to a convention.
This leads to distinguishing public meaning from private codes or suppressed programs. A composer might have a private story in mind, but if they don't share it, it's not part of the work's public meaning.
Like a secret message only they understand.
Or a suppressed program, like maybe Shostakovich embedding political critique. But that's different from the inherent public meaning of the music itself, in the way a novel's plot is its public meaning.
So McClary's Tchaikovsky story, or Schroeder's Haydn philosophy, are likely private readings or suppressed programs, not the public meaning conveyed by the music as music.
That's the formalist argument. Music just doesn't have the semantic tools of language. Key takeaway. Music lacks the linguistic resources for complex narrative or philosophy.
Okay, there's another argument against narrative interpretations too, right? Something about repetition.
Yes. This is a fascinating structural point. Absolute music is incredibly repetitive.
How so?
Both internally, motifs, melodies, rhythms recurring constantly within a movement, and externally, composers literally writing instructions to repeat entire large sections, sometimes multiple times.
You mean the repeat signs in the score?
Exactly. Now imagine telling a story or performing a play like Hamlet and constantly repeating lines, scenes, even whole acts.
It would be completely nonsensical. Unbearable, probably.
Precisely. Narrative collapses under that kind of repetition, but absolute music thrives on it. Repetition is fundamental to musical structure and enjoyment.
So if a symphony were really a narrative, its structure would be absurd from a storytelling perspective.
That's the point. This fundamental difference in how they treat repetition suggests they are simply different kinds of art forms with different principles.
That's a strong argument. Okay, the source uses a thought experiment to wrap this up. Mo, Larry, and Curly.
Yes. Mo loves Renaissance paintings, but only sees abstract patterns, ignoring the people and stories.
Okay, He's missing the point.
Larry loves the sound of German poetry, but understands zero German.
Also missing the point.
Curly loves classical music, the sounds, the structure, the emotional contours, but perceives no specific narrative or philosophical arguments.
Now, is Curly missing the point?
Oh, that's the question. The source argues that Curly represents legions of sophisticated, knowledgeable music lovers. Unlike Mo and Larry, Curly isn't necessarily failing to grasp the essence of the art form.
Because the supposed content, the story or philosophy in absolute music can be, and often is, completely ignored by people who deeply appreciate the music itself.
Exactly. You can't really appreciate Renaissance painting while ignoring the figures or German poetry without understanding the words. But you can appreciate a symphony without subscribing to a specific narrative interpretation. That's a huge difference.
So back to the initial worry. Is music just meaningless noise if formalism is right? Interpretations like McClary's or Schroeder's try to fill that perceived void with meaning.
They do. But the source finds these attempts ultimately unsatisfying as explanations for music's profound impact. The stories or philosophies music can supposedly convey seem pretty thin compared to what literature or philosophy proper can do.
The intellectual import, achievable through music alone, seems limited.
That's the argument. And even if you accept these interpretations, many people cherish the music without them, finding deep satisfaction in the meaningless sounds and structures themselves. So, enhanced formalism, focusing on aesthetic appreciation of the form and its expressive qualities, still stands as a strong account.
So we've journeyed through quite a few ideas: personal associations, music having inherent emotions, the persona theory, the tendency theory, narrative interpretations, philosophical ones.
And landed on a view that emphasizes appreciating the music's beauty and aesthetic qualities as the core emotional experience, distinguishing that from simply feeling the emotions the music might express or decoding hidden stories.
It separates the personal reaction from the artistic substance and questions whether music's main job is to tell detailed stories or argue philosophical points.
Which leaves us, and you, with a final thought to chew on. If music's deepest impact isn't primarily about specific stories or complex ideas, what is the core of its undeniable power? What makes these organized sounds so significant to us?
Something to reflect on during your next listen. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.